Everyone is surviving the rigors of this busy time of year. I know that you've got a lot going on, so we'll get started here and jump right in to see if anybody has any questions to start off with. We'll let you think about that for a minute and just apprise you of what's upcoming in our double session today. We'll continue with our discussion of antidepressant drugs to begin with. That'll probably take a good share of the first hour here. If we get through that adequately, then we'll jump into our focal toxicology section, which of course will continue this afternoon and then wrap things up. It's just stunning to me to think that we're at this point in the semester. Wow, time just flies by, it seems like, to me. Hard to believe, but that's where we are. Okay, any thoughts before we get going? Everybody hearing me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great, thank you. Just to reassure my paranoia. Okay. Well, yesterday we launched into this important segment on antidepressant drugs. It's an area that in many ways was long ignored, or if not necessarily ignored, in which there was not enough progress to be satisfactory, despite the fact that with information like this, we know what a severe need there is in the United States and elsewhere for therapeutic interventions with severe depression, including drug interventions. And of course, the drug aspect is only part of the therapeutic realm as far as frank depression is concerned. And so we quickly went through the idea that that depression is a systemic disorder in which first of all, there's probably many different types of depression and multiple important brain areas as far as targeting the disorder is concerned. Made a special play on the hippocampus from the diencephalon and talked about in terms of origins of underlying mechanisms for at least certain types of depression, the biogenic amine theory, which about a half century ago postulated inadequacies as far as 5-HT or serotonin and norepinephrine is concerned. And eventually the biogenic amine theory sort of got a little bit more complex as we envisioned not just levels of neurotransmitters were off, but entire regulatory systems for important neurotransmitters were involved. So serotonin has been thought to be a big player in the pathology associated with at least some types of depression, and this has been recognized for quite some time. It took a real turn to even more important with the introduction of the SSRI Prozac type drugs now a few decades back. And so the general realm of serotonin, you can refer back to Katie's lectures on that, and I'll just move on from that point right here. So this is one of those ridiculously impossible slides that is designed basically to suggest complexity. And I think all the different things that are listed on here would certainly suggest that. So, some of the biogenic amines that we've already talked about, some other biogenic amines as well as hormones, and a variety of sites of action throughout the brain and other parts of the body. So there's certainly nothing on a slide like this that could be asked on an exam. But if we sort of get the point that there's just a lot of potentially interactive aspects in the brain and elsewhere, including many which we probably haven't discovered yet, which will unfold during your clinical and research lifetimes. Would like to make the point that at least partially depression is a stress disorder. And with that in hand, then we can recognize the various aspects of the stress response that we have been talking about from the very beginning, such as the hypothalamic pituitary axis, particularly in regulating the adrenal glands, both cortex and medulla, really. And so we've talked a lot about before how stress is an adaptive response, which is actually useful in terms of progression of life, but on the other hand, it can become pathological if it occurs too severely or for too long. And so there are certainly aspects of stress associated with depression. It's not the whole story, but it's a parameter of importance. And this is just sort of this slide entitled Corticosteroids and Depression is just emphasizing those ideas in some written words a little bit. So I won't belabor this more than just to recognize the importance of this particular stress system. The nucleus accumbens is a brain region which you've heard about before. You can see that this slide was actually intended for another talk, potential role in depression. See tomorrow. Well, tomorrow is today. Katie talked about it a little bit in the context of dependency and addiction-related phenomena. So just trying to hit a few highlights here in terms of potential points of interaction physiologically and pathophysiologically associated with depression and other disorders. And the same thing can be said for the anterior cingulate gyrus. I would especially like to note the connections associated with OCD, which we'll talk about ever so briefly as we conclude the session today. But many analysts consider obsessive compulsive disorders to be under the umbrella of anxiety disorders, and since there's relationships between anxiety and depression, thought I'd toss that in here for our consideration. Also, if we hearken back to last week when we were talking about antipsychotic drugs, we can see from this slide that some of the cognitive aspects of schizophrenia may also be originating from this particular brain region. It's interesting to note, many of you probably already realize that one of the older but still useful categories of antidepressant drugs are the so-called tricyclic antidepressants. And if we look back at the antipsychotic lectures, we see there again that the phenothiazine antipsychotics are tricyclic compounds from a organic chemical context. Some observers over the years have sort of equated the antipsychotic compounds and the antidepressant compounds together. Um, and although that's a bit of a reach, I think there certainly are relationships between the two sets of pharmacological agents, which at least in part are reminiscent of each other. From the hormonal standpoint, uh, oxytocin is a player in some types of depression. I think certainly not all. And what I've put up here is a hormonally based slide to sort of remind ourselves uh, a little bit about the nature of oxytocin as a general hormonal substance, which has been analyzed from a hormonal standpoint for quite some time. But the connection with certain types of depression is relatively new. And part of it may have something to do with the fact that oxytocin is you know a big player in terms of intrahuman as well as other animal connectivity, and the fact that there's associations with maternity and pregnancy and so on is not too surprising that something like oxytocin is a player in mood, and that problems that occur with oxytocin physiology can also be players in certain types of depression. So this is a pretty active area of research, and one that I would suggest that people keep track on, because it may become a bigger factor in the design of uh, pharmacotherapeutic interventions, as well as non-pharmacological interventions in upcoming years. So um, the real importance of our lecture today is with respect to drug agents themselves in a course like our own. And as you can see from this slide, and probably reminiscent of previous studies that you've had with antidepressants, there are multiple subclasses of antidepressant drugs, some of which are more prominent than others. And there's clearly a time-based aspect of these subclasses in terms of when they were introduced. Uh, the mono the first generation agents are either the monoamine oxidase inhibitors or the tricyclics. I guess depending a little bit upon when you start counting and how prominent you want to consider various subcategories to be. But at any rate, the MAO inhibitors and the tricyclic antidepressants have both been around for uh, close to uh, half a century in terms of therapeutic intervention. And you may not always hear that much about the MAO inhibitors. They're pretty general in their actions, as you know from previous work that we've done in here and elsewhere. Monoamine oxidase is an important um, enzyme as far as the metabolism of a variety of substances are concerned. So there's many different monoamines, and monoamine oxidase inhibitors are only slightly specific with respect to various monoamines. So um, monoamine oxidase inhibitors are extremely powerful ways of approaching uh, depression-related phenomena, and really are not first line agents because of the generalities of their action. But if other things aren't working out too well, the monoamine inhibitors are used with caution in clinical depression. Um, but some of the other subcategories here are more important than the MAO inhibitors in the sense of a first line of address pharmacologically for depression. So many people consider the tricyclic antidepressants, or the TCAs, as being the first generation agents, and they functioned in that regard for a considerable amount of time until the introduction of the SSRIs, in particular Prozac, a few decades ago. Um, so the launch of the Prozac type drugs certainly upped the ante as far as serotonin was concerned, as the name suggests. And for a long time, um, serotonin was perhaps even too much of an overriding interest. Not to say it isn't important, it is, but it also is not the only thing that's involved. But with the introduction of the Prozac-like drugs, the tricyclics shrunk back in terms of their overall utilization in this particular area. They didn't disappear, uh, and indeed, in this day and age, a couple of decades into the 21st century, the tricyclics have made a comeback to some degree, um, because there is useful efficacy there, even if they might be a little bit more general in their actions than the SSRIs are. But part of the sort of slip back into use of the tricyclics a little bit more recently recognizes that selectivity is not the only consideration as far as treating depression is concerned. And indeed, with such a multifaceted disorder as depression, in some cases, agents which aren't all that specific are of use, and the tricyclics would fit into that category. There's also a number of agents, trazodone being an example, and we'll talk about it just a little bit more here in a few minutes, of agents that we have a hard time classifying. Uh, drug classification has been a big deal for us as we've launched into pharmacology this semester, and so I think you're all aware of sort of the emphasis that pharmacologists um, put upon classification. So, if there's a drug which is hard to classify, it creates anxiety amongst pharmacologists, and their struggle as to, well, what sort of a tag can we put on it? So one of the tags that sometimes put on some of these agents which don't nicely fit into some of these other categories is so-called atypical. And what that really amounts to, when you find pharmacologists utilizing terminology like atypical antidepressant or atypical whatever drug realm we're talking about, means we don't know. And so it's kind of a grab bag category in which a number of unrelated agents are often found, unrelated except for the fact that they're used clinically for a particular aspect of things, such as here the realm of depression. So lower in the slide, I've talked about some so-called newer generation agents, of which there are a number of those now, and they harken back to the tricyclics a little bit, in that most of these so-called new generation agents are not only inhibitors of serotonin transport, but transport of one or more of the other familiar biogenic amines, such as norepinephrine or dopamine, as well as others, I'm sure, eventually. Um, so there has been quite a pipeline of production of these newer agents in in recent years, and they have a profile which is a little bit different than the SSRIs, and so we need to recognize that. And undoubtedly, there's going to be more of these agents coming along, with the emphasis that there is on depression therapeutics and looking for agents which are useful in a variety of types of depression. I'm sure that Big Pharma will continue to produce uh, newer generation agents uh, during your lifetimes as practitioners. So we'll talk about that just a little bit as we're kind of wrapping up this particular segment. And then I listed natural products again, um, uh, not necessarily because they constitute a subcategory necessarily alone, but because we can easily, I think, identify agents like St. John's wort as being natural products which have utility as far as treating depression is concerned. And as you know, there's often uh, uh, question marks surrounding efficacy of certain natural product agents. But St. John's wort is one in which I can pretty confidently say there's enough clinical evidence out there to suggest efficacy of to make St. John's wort an interesting substance in this particular regard. So let's just spend a little time on each one of these categories, and starting with the tricyclics. And I've listed three prominent tricyclics here. Um, Again, there are multiple specific examples in a category like this, and we could make a very uh, strong case for including more names on our list. But to try to keep the list at a manageable level at this point, I've just on my own uh, picked the three that are listed here. I think the first two of these, amitriptyline and imipramine, are very commonly considered prototypes in this particular area, and certainly in the history of this area, uh, those two are very commonly utilized. Um, Mechanism of action, there's a considerable association or correlation with blocking reuptake or transport of norepinephrine and serotonin in key uh, brain regions. Uh, but whether that's the true mechanism or mechanisms of action um, remains to be seen. And as you know, correlations are nice, but they're not necessarily causative in their overall regard. So you're going to uh, almost universally see the interaction of these substances with transport as being mechanistically important. But I would remain just a little bit skeptical about whether that's the whole story in terms of their mechanism of action or not. And research continues in these areas, and I am confident that it changes of our understanding of the action of these substances, even the older ones like the tricyclics, will be a part of your neuropharmacological understanding in upcoming years. Um, some key things to consider with respect to the tricyclics. Many of them do have direct receptor actions. Also, you don't hear so much about that, But when you couple transport phenomena with receptor phenomena, you may be getting a little bit closer to the changes in regulatory events which occur mechanistically with respect to utilization of these agents. Um, One thing that gives us pause is a time frame, and a lot like the antipsychotics, the clinical utility of these agents frequently takes quite a while to take hold in the realm of weeks or longer. Um, Yet even if we go back to blocking reuptake, those effects are occurring quite rapidly upon first administration of drug. So the fact that it takes quite a while for the full efficacy to occur, if the full efficacy is going to occur at all, would suggest changes in dynamic regulation in the brain, um, some of which, some or all of which may have to do with biogenic amines, but I doubt all. I think some of which. So keep the sort of the slowness temporally of these agents in mind. Um, the agents overall are not ones which um, show a lot of severe adversity. I mean, there's adversity there, as there is with any drug category. But one place I would suggest keeping in mind as a focal point for potential adverse reactions is the autonomic nervous system, and you'll hear more about that specifically next semester when Doug Coffin launches into our coverage, specific coverage of cardiovascular aspects and the autonomic role in that particular regard. And so certainly there can be particularly cardiovascular uh, aspects of dysregulation associated with adversity of the tricyclics, as well as to some degree other antidepressant agents. Um, if an individual is utilizing a tricyclic, it's kind of like utilizing an antipsychotic. It's not necessarily a suggestion that that individual is using it for psychotic purposes. And the same thing with the tricyclics here in the realm of depression. Enuresis is bedwetting, and it's tough to treat in any mode, but especially pharmacologically. But the tricyclics have been long used in that particular regard. We've already talked about the fact that depression is considered by many as under the umbrella of anxiety. So perhaps not surprising to see um, anxiety-related phenomena being treated with the tricyclics or other antidepressant drugs. And ADHD is another area. The tricyclics are certainly not first-line therapy in ADHD, but many different things are tried and used sometimes successfully in ADHD. We know that the stimulants themselves are frequently utilized in that regard, and in some individuals um, who need drug treatment as part of their therapeutic regimen. The tricyclics constitute a parameter in that particular sense. And then I just end this little segment by reemphasizing the fact that even though the tricyclics are rather old in the context of how long have they been available for therapeutic use, that they still are useful, if not exactly first-line drugs in the first couple of decades in our current century. So the SSRI category, um, led by the prototype fluoxetine, um, has been a huge drug category, not only with respect to depression, but just overall in terms of pharmacotherapy in recent decades. And when Prozac was first introduced, and I'm trying to think, maybe around 1980 or so, somewhere in there, 3 to 5 decades ago. Um, this was one of those revolutionary moments that we talk about a little bit in pharmacology, and the emphasis upon serotonin received huge emphasis, and even popular news sources at the time. It wasn't an internet world at the time, but people were getting their information via magazines and journals and so on, and prominent news journals like Time Magazine and Newsweek and so on featured Prozac on their covers because it was making such a splash, uh, and rightfully so. It's a very efficacious agent, relatively small adversity associated with it, and despite being a little bit aged itself, still a very prominent agent here in 2020. Uh, Not a hard conclusion to reach, that when you have such success as was reached with Prozac, that big pharma um, launched into a whole emphasis upon Me Too's, and the, the the first three listed in this slide are true SSRIs. Um, I'll talk about the others a little bit later on when we talk about newer generation agents. Um, but certainly three prominent SSRIs, and you can just sort of count on exam questions on these first three: fluoxetine, paroxetine, paroxetine perhaps being one of the most specific towards serotonin, and then sertraline, which along the way has had its emphases. Um, Went it the wrong way there. Uh, Let me just pause here to talk about adversity a little bit. It's of course going to vary from individual to individual, and the fact that each one of these drugs um, is not exactly the same as each other is suggested by the fact that individuals react to these drugs uh, uh, with differences between people. And so what works for someone taking Prozac may not work for another individual. And the adversity that's associated with whether the individual can tolerate the Prozac or not varies from individual to individual. And so quite often it takes some time to titrate out the efficacy versus adversity of these agents before the right one for a given individual is found. Um, Let me just switch to some of these other agents here. Some of which, of course, like Wellbutrin and Cymbalta, will show up again in our newer generation agent. So it's up to individual classifiers a little bit as to exactly where you slot these things in. So bupropion and duloxetine may or may not sort of be considered atypical antidepressants by everyone. But trazodone or Desiril, which is perhaps more commonly utilized than one might imagine, is a good example of an antidepressant where we really don't know how to classify it other than in this sort of other category. And like many of these drugs, um, Desiril is utilized for purposes that are not necessarily depression related. So here's the sort of scoop on some of these newer generation agents. Again, just a very minimal slide, because there have been a whole bunch of these that have been introduced and are being introduced right now. So I've listed three that sort of um, top the list, at least from my particular standpoint. Uh, we can toss Wellbutrin in there as well, although the Wellbutrin is a little bit more inclined towards dopamine than the others that are listed, which are a little bit more inclined towards norepinephrine reuptake. But serotonin in all the cases. Um, these certainly are typically not really called SSRIs anymore because of the involvement of either dopamine or norepinephrine. Uh, but even though that we've moved away from serotonin as a singular target, it's still there as a multiple target. And so, sort of like dopamine seems to find its way into all the antipsychotics, serotonin really finds its way into literally all of the antidepressants. So certainly, as we understand more about subtypes of depression, those subtypes defined not only on a behavioral basis, but on a biochemical and pharmacological basis, um, will suggest that from a biogenic amine standpoint, at least, that dopamine and norepinephrine may well play a bigger role um, than originally envisioned when we sort of went off the charts with our emphasis upon serotonin a little ways back. So there are at least a couple of exam questions from the Back to the Future slide. And, I would suggest that from the standpoint on our last exam, from the questions that I've written, it's heavily oriented towards classification. And so, if you see Pristique listed on there, classify it as a antidepressant agent, and then take a look at the other choices that exist and recognize that they're typically not recognized as antidepressant agents, and therefore you've got your answer. So every one of these little categories that have uh, a few agents which I've listed are potential sources of exam questions here in a few days. And I think if you take a tactical view towards classification and a few major drugs and a few major actions in these given categories, you're going to be in fantastic shape on the exam. So even though relatively minor players in the overall realm compared to the SSRIs and the newer generation agents and even the tricyclics, the monoamine oxidase inhibitors are used, but usually only after one of the more commonly utilized, one or more of the commonly utilized agents has either not worked or has worked and then doesn't work so well after a long intervention. So these agents are utilized, but of course, because of their generality of action, um, have a greater adversity profile, including with respect to the autonomic nervous system, than the SSRIs or the SNRIs are considered. And we've already seen in both presentations from Katie and myself that monoamine oxidase inhibitors are utilized in other realms, such as some of the neurodegenerative disorders, such as Parkinson's. So this is definitely not a category that is isolated to the antidepressants alone. But I would, the first agent on this list, I would recognize because I think you'll see it again in a few days on an exam. So here's just a little bit more on adversities. The involvement of these agents autonomically uh, can lead to sexual dysfunction. So that's a fairly prominent sort of thing for consideration. Um, all of these agents, and this harkens back a little bit to the antipsychotics too, tend to involve themselves with metabolic phenomena and therefore unwanted weight changes. And that varies a lot from agent to agent and from person to person. The bottom point here is an important one. In some individuals, it's not a real high percentage, but some individuals, these agents actually go in the wrong direction. And, in many cases, we're trying to hold down the probability of suicidal ideation or attempts. But because of subtypes of depression, um, sometimes this can go in the wrong direction. And there's been a lot of discussion of this in about the last 5 to 10 years. And some people have their doubts about the antidepressant agents because of this particular problem. Uh, I'm one that suggests what we need to do is just keep very close tabs on individuals who are utilizing these agents therapeutically. And, if there's, problems associated with ideas associated with suicide, then that has to be taken care of in terms of that uh, close um, watching that's going on there. I'd hate to see the antidepressant area get tossed out because of this, because there's been so much progress which has occurred with the development of these agents. So it's like anything, they're not perfect. We have to recognize that imperfection and address that as well as we can. Uh, I'm not going to spend much time on the remainder of this presentation, but I did want to mention that uh, there are, of course, non-drug types of intervention. One which might surprise you a little bit is electroconvulsive therapy, because it got a very bad name decades ago, which it probably should have had at that time. But there have been major advances that have occurred in electroconvulsive therapy, such that it's a much the cost benefit ratios are very different than they used to be. And so in certain types of refractory depression, ECT is actually a lifesaver. Um, so psychotherapy is almost always an important component of intervention. And so we just need to consider things beyond the drug realm. Um, Homeostatic aspects are important here, and the fact that depression occurs may be related to laws of homeostasis itself in terms of biogenic immune regulatory phenomena, and the utilization of antidepressant drugs may well be an indication of at least partial reestablishment of homeostasis. I mentioned OCD back there a few minutes ago, and OCD is tough to treat. Um, Certain types of personality-related disorder, OCD, are almost untreatable with drugs, but other types of OCD help can occur with cognitive behavioral therapy, probably plus an antidepressant drug, including the SSRIs. And actually also including some of the tricyclics such as clomipramine. Um, so there's sort of multiple avenues of address that are tried with respect to OCD treatment. We've talked about post-traumatic stress disorder a little bit, and of course, there's tremendous need for help in this particular regard, some of which is drug related. I must say that although the SSRIs are probably first line drug treatment in cases of PTSD, um, they're not always as useful as we would like them to be. And so I'm sure we're going to see continuations of cognitive behavioral therapy as well as SSRIs, but also newer types of agents, some of which have not been identified yet. And I think very soon here, we're going to see new agents introduced, which will be more useful than what we've been able to introduce in the past as far as pharmacology is concerned. So that's going to be a big area and one of a lot of hope for the potential introduction of new agents. Bipolar disorders, which when I was first learning pharmacology, were called the manic depressive disorders, um, is a very important area. And many classifiers, including in our textbooks, tend to put bipolar disorders under the venue of the antipsychotic agents. I do it a little bit differently, and I don't claim to be a sage in terms of knowing more about it than anybody else. But to me, it more logically fits under the realm of depression, um, uh, or overall in the realm of affective or mood related disorders. Although the utilization of other sort of more consistently defined antidepressant agents like the ones we've just talked about uh, is often not as successful and sometimes is even dangerous in terms of bipolar. So other agents are typically more commonly utilized in treating bipolar. Um, and here's just a few words on it. And some of these other agents, which I'll emphasize, including anticonvulsives, which Katie talked about, such as carbamazepine. But lithium, and in the United States, the lithium salt, lithium carbonate, has been the historically utilized agent in bipolar. Um, uh, Carbamazepine and valproic acid, which are anticonvulsives, are uh, frequently encountered. Also, it's possible that at least some types of bipolar may be channelopathies, and therefore the utilization of anticonvulsant agents. And then I listed a couple of newer generation antipsychotic agents. Lastly, because these have become popular crossover agents in the realm of bipolar. And so this is just a little bit more in um, printed out words from what I just said. I don't think there's anything on this slide that's new relative to what I've just said a minute or so ago. Sort of slow onset also with these agents, and with respect to lithium itself, fairly hard to know exactly what the mechanism of action is, but channels may be involved, and lithium is an agent with considerable adversity in a variety of sites, including especially the cardiovascular and renal systems. So doses have to be titrated very, very carefully and watched very, very carefully. And there's a very, very steep dose response relationship with lithium. Just going to mention a few slides here at the end. Uh, these slides, beginning with this one, now go back to this one here. Questions on the exam, absolutely. Probably with respect to both lithium and carbamazepine. Questions on our last exam with respect to these other serotonergic drugs? No, not from me. You've already covered that with Katie, and so I just have these tossed in from past practice a little bit, but they're off the board in terms of our upcoming exam. And so that's it for antidepressants. We'll take a look at some hopefully interesting aspects of of toxicology this afternoon. And I know we're out of time, so I will stop and see if anybody has any questions. Hang in here for just a few moments until we break for lunch, and then see you again at 1 p.m.
I had a quick question, Keith.
Go for it.
You have venlafaxine underneath both the SSRIs and the SNRIs.
It's better to put it under the SNRIs.
Okay.
I mean, they're very serotonin oriented reagents, but they're broader than that. And so the best place to fit them would be under the SNRIs.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.